So we're going to keep looking at different types of models and ways to kind of consider how to actually institute organizational change. We're also going to talk a little bit about the difference between organizational development versus organizational transformation, OT versus OD, which is kind of a way to conceptualize. Again, it's the reason that we do it is a broad model of what's going on currently in the organization. So just as a reminder, we're still at that first of the 5 stages of organizational development. We're at the stage where we're discussing tools to help you conceptualize what is going on in an organization, to conceptualize how the organization actually exists, and to identify areas where potential change could actually benefit the organization. We're also talking about models that we can use to communicate to decision makers the need for change and to help them conceptualize it as well. So we've mainly been focusing on the open systems model of organizations, and I'm going to continue returning to that throughout the course. But there are other models I want to at least briefly touch on. And one of the more modern ones is the socio-technical systems model. So again, this is a fairly similar model, but it kind of recognizes that if in open systems we have those five components, we have the inputs, the throughputs, the outputs, the feedback loop, and the environment itself. But if organizational development primarily occurs in 1/5 of that, the actual throughput section, maybe our models need to be a little bit more focused on that throughput. So the socio-technical system model kind of expands and focuses without ignoring those other aspects at the throughputs part. And it basically is a model to help you understand how an organization coordinates its human and technical activities and breaks it into 5 broad areas: the goals and values of the organization, the technical subsystems, the structural subsystems, the psychosocial subsystems, and the managerial subsystems. So just briefly thinking about this, what is the overall stated goals and values of the organization? What are its values that people are supposed to adhere to, that their products are supposed to represent, but also what are the bottom line goals of the organization? Technical subsystems, what are the tools and technologies and current best practices that the organization uses? Structural subsystem, how is the organization actually structured physically? So what is the management reporting lines? What are the who are the subordinates, who are the superiors, what are the lines of communication, and how is the organization structured? The psychosocial subsystem, so how do those goals and values actually transmit themselves into an actual organizational culture made up of the people in the organization? And finally, what is the managerial subsystem within that? So within the structural, psychosocial, goals and values, and technical subsystem, how is management actually handled? So a visual representation of this model is that we still have a super system of the environment. And within that environment is where all of those other elements of the open systems model lies. So we have inputs and output flow of material, energy, and information. It basically suggests the idea that the environment is something that can be lumped into one large category of what needs to be monitored. You need to monitor what's coming in, you need to monitor what's going out, and you need to monitor the environment as a whole. But that monitoring is one part of organizational development, and it should be monitoring all of those components. While the main focus of organizational development is going to be the actual throughput, and this is a more intricate model of what that throughput might look like. So again, we have this managerial subsystem in the middle because, and the reason we put it there is it's the managerial subsystem that is going to help create and codify, if you will, the structure. It's going to hopefully have input of both understanding and actually helping to change the psychosocial culture of the employees. It's going to be managerial is the goal of communicating the goals and values to how do you actually incorporate those in the day-to-day activities. And finally, it's going to be monitoring how the actual technical subsystems all work. So this creates a model of let's try to identify where the problem is. Is the problem in management? And notice that management is central in this model. And the reason for that is that generally speaking, the managerial subsystem is the first thing we're going to look for problems. So if there's a problem communicating clean ideas from one subsystem to another, well, where would that be occurring? Probably in the managerial subsystem. The other thing is if there is an isolated problem, we're going to be needing the managerial subsystem to implement the changes. So that's why it's central in this model to recognize that a problem in the managerial subsystem can create issues throughout the rest of the organization and the interaction between the other subsystems. And if there is a problem in one of the other subsystems, managerial subsystems is what we're going to use to hopefully create an intervention and implement that intervention. So notice everything's interrelated. So the technical subsystems, so the tools that are used, are hopefully the result of the goals and values, but also may limit what goals and values can be done. The technical substructure, which also is going to include the ability to communicate information and just communication between areas, is going to impact the actual structure of the organization. But likewise, the structure of the organization is going to impact how successful the organization can be at implementing its goals and values, as well as the structure is going to indicate what kind of technical subsystems are needed. And all of these are going to interact with the actual psychosocial system. So again, when we're looking for a problem in an organization, we can look and go, what are the goals and values, and are those conducive to actually getting the objectives of the organization done? Then we can ask, well, if those are fine, does the organization have the best practices, the actual technology, the materials, and tools to actually obtain those goals, technical subsystems? Do we have our organization structured in an optimal way to increase throughput? And this is one of the areas organizational development will often focus, changing the structural subsystems of an organization. So moving from a bureaucratic organization to more of a team-based organization, for example. And finally, what is the actual organizational culture or organizational climate like? So how do the employees view the technical subsystems, the managerial subsystems, the structural subsystems? Are they positive towards these? Are they negative? Are they reacting to them? And also the psychosocial subsystem is often something we're also going to focus at in any intervention, because we need buy-in and participation from the actual people in the organization to make organizational developmental changes successful. So another thing we often talk about in organizational development is the idea of high-performance systems. And a high-performance system rarely occurs by chance. Generally, a high-performance system has to be designed. And again, a high-performance system is just a good buzzword to talk about. We're looking at the throughputs, and we're trying to create the most efficient way to create an intervention or a mechanism within the organization's throughputs that attends to the goals and the values of the organization, is utilizing the optimal technical subsystems, that we have a structural subsystem which allows this kind of progress to happen, this high performance system, and that the managerial and psychosocial subsystems are all on board with it. So key variables in creating a high performance system is the business situation, strategies that are developed within the organization. Again, this idea of designing elements. So thinking about how each person or each group of people contributes to the actual creation of a product. And finally, the culture and results. So is the culture conducive to creating high performance systems, or is it going to resist creating high performance systems? And again, do the high performance systems actually result in positive increases in productivity and quality of product? There's also contingency approach, and again, I'm talking about broad concepts here, but again, that's the level we're at right now, kind of thinking in organizational terms. What is the model that we're using to actually conceptualize the organization? Are we trying to move towards a high performance system to where we're increasing productivity or quality of product? Are we simply wanting to create a situation where the organization is ready to adapt to change? And that's kind of a contingency approach. Considers an organization and its environment and tries to identify if-then relationships. In other words, this is an organization that is in a contingency approach. One of the ways to think about it is from the previous module, where we are talking about a model where you conceptualize where the organization is based on stability and its adaptation to change. A contingency approach is also going to be often going to kind of match into that high stability, low adaptation. So plans are being made. There's suggested changes in direction if needed, but they are all contingency approaches of, if this situation occurs, this is what we're going to do. Again, we've talked about future shock, but I want to just return to the concept again for a moment and recognize that what future shock refers to is too much change in a too short of time is going to have negative impact on any organization. In fact, generally speaking, organizations need to be aware that when you do changes, people are naturally resistant to them, even if they are positive changes that in the long run will actually make their jobs better. In the previous module, I recently mentioned the fact that a lot of classes have moved to basically smartphone polling in in-person classes, and that I haven't necessarily made that change myself yet. And an example of that is that's again, I'm resisting change. Not because the change is bad, not because it's a bad idea, it's just I'm naturally resistant to it. So the more change you try to force on someone, the more likely they are to adapt. And if someone came in and said, you have no choice, you have to start doing these polls, for a little while, I'm going to do them, honestly, just human nature. I'm going to resist a bit. I'm going to probably do the bare minimum I'm required. That doesn't mean that I'm actually wholeheartedly participating or buying in to this new intervention. You need to do these polls. Now, once I start doing them and I learn the technology, eventually I'll probably recognize, okay, this really is a good tool. I'll start using them more. And so we're going to see that increase, but it's not going to be immediate. There's going to be a reactive period. So when we're talking about future shock, we're talking about an organizational development expert thinking about what is the optimal amount of change to do in a way that is going to have the minimal amount of negative effect. So generally speaking, we have to assume that organizations are kind of a push-pull situation of management often being asked to create change and the employees as a passive group to some degree, or maybe think of it as a passive-aggressive group, are going to naturally resist those change. So management also can become very strained when having to deal with too much change. And really what we're talking about here is trying to recognize that when we're changing an organization, Future Shock reminds us that we want to be very mindful of how we're changing an organization, how many changes we're trying to institute at a time, and that the best and most successful way to manage change is to do it in a systematic and incremental way. Now, notice that we've been already kind of hinting around the idea that when we're talking about organizational development, we can be talking about it proactively. So, a renewing organization that's kind of always thinking about how do we innovate, how do we change. Well, that's an organization that's going to be also being able to do it a little bit more slowly because they're trying to predict what changes are needed for the future. When we're in that reactive environment, so the management is not typically oriented towards change, innovation, and renewal. When change is forced on them, they're going to have to change a lot and do it quickly, which brings us into the situation where that organization is also going to probably get a lot of resistance from future shock. So that gets us to the concept of basically differentiating two types of interventions in an organization. Organizational transformation, OT, versus organizational development. And this class is about organizational development, and they are two different approaches. Their goals are the same. The tools will often be the same. What really makes the difference is whether the organization has the time to do it quote unquote right, or if it's having to do it in an emergency reaction way. So OT and OD are approaches to managing change, and both are major ways of managing change. One of them is reactive or revolution, and one of them is proactive or evolution. And again, the reason I'm going over this right now is this is another great way to communicate the need for an organization to develop kind of that renewal culture, the kind of ability to do the changes as needed prior to them becoming a crisis and in a more meaningful way to reduce the natural downside of trying to change organizations. And that downside being reaction from the actual employees. So organizational transformation, OT changes an organization's form and appearance. So usually one of the ways we can differentiate organizational transformation, and transformation usually is seen as a positive word, but in this context, we're usually referring to organizational transformation as a very violent and reactive process. So one of the first things we can notice is usually organizational transformation is from the top down and is really focused on broad sweeping changes to the entire form and appearance of an organization's structure. Another way to think of it is that it is revolution. A revolution is violent, it is sudden, and it is usually a momentum that can't be stopped. And that's what's happening. Something in the environment is forcing this organization to have to make changes. The transformations are usually focused on the actual framework or structure of the organization itself, and it's usually very unplanned or not well thought out top-down changes that's in a response to external pressure. Changes often occur in a very short frame of time. And we can kind of think of quick examples of this. Anytime an organization has a sudden need to downsize, and what this usually means is that the organization had a size and organizational structure dependent on the current environment and its current product line. Suddenly, there's a big dip. For example, if it's an automaker, demand for cars went down this year and sales were down 15%. Well, the current size of the organization cannot be profitable with its size that was designed to make 15% more cars than are being bought. That organization is now having to do a transformation, what we often refer to as a downsizing, or if you want to euphemize it, a right sizing of the organization. That's an example of an organizational transformation. It is a sudden structural change to an organization in response to an environmental change that was not anticipated and not planned for. Organizational development, what we're focusing on this class, and what we want to get organizations to realize that once you place in organizational development, you're also creating a structure within the organization to hopefully fend off the need to ever go into organizational transformation. So OD should be by its nature an evolution of constantly doing slower but well-planned large-scale interventions to change the organization in response to the environment. Generally speaking, organizational development is on a longer time frame, in fact, a continuous time frame. OT usually is responsive, massive change, and then back to stability. Organizational development is more about constantly doing moderated, carefully controlled changes to adapt to the environment as those changes are happening. More gradual in implementation. And it modifies typically the total organization's parts and elements within those throughputs, but also it often is both top down and can be bottom up. Small changes in how the organization does individual components of its work to make the overall better. So individual changes, team changes, organizational changes. And organizational development often focuses on team effectiveness, so kind of a mid-level area, how the groups within the organization itself work to get to those goals to adapt to that environment. So the emphasis is on improving problem solving, how to work through conflicts and communication, and how to create teams that are more effective. And then teams are actually broken up by their process and their activity. So activity, what the team does, and process, how the team works. Now, again, we're going to get into much more detail on exactly how we use teams in organizational development, and it is one of the major tools in the OD toolkit. But again, it's a good idea to kind of think about that this, by the fact that this is one of the go-to interventions that many organizations can benefit from, it is kind of focused on that, creating a slow process of moving towards teams, because once we have teams, teams are more successful at further restructuring, further adaptation, and are usually also a more adaptive structure for an organization to have in a non-stable environment. So process observations of teams examine how the teams actually function, how leadership and decision-making and communication occur. So there's kind of two levels. The creation of teams, recognizing that teams are going to have team activities and team process, or if teams pre-exist, process observations to look to see how those teams are actually functioning. And again, generally speaking, our entire purpose is to focus on organizational effectiveness. So we are focusing on the total organizational systems to improve effectiveness by changes in its structure, its technology, and its management. And structure can be such examples as the actual reporting structure and moving from individuals working in departments to actual work teams working on specific subsections of the products that are produced by the organization. Changes in how technology is used and what technology is available, and again, changes in how management is viewed, often moving management from more of a reactive to more of a participative style of work. Just a couple of quick examples of cultures and organizations that have kind of done this. They've incorporated OD into their corporate culture and are now creating very adaptive environments where change comes naturally. So Google is known for kind of a freewheeling managerial style. So their managers are kind of given a broad overview of their tasks, and those tasks are kind of built in this societal technical systems model of that their jobs are to monitor the psychosocial health of their employees, the actual structural organization of the teams, what technology is being used, and also the goals of the organization. And they're challenged to further develop creative culture, co-managed by a group of people. So again, we have multiple people that are actually involved in even the top level of decision, and it's created a very innovative culture in a world workforce of over 20,000 people. And they also use very fluid work groups. So they have teams that are used to working together, but they're allowed to move to projects that interest them. And in fact, even employees are encouraged to take a portion of their time to spend it on projects that are even sub-projects or projects with other teams. So that's the fluid part. Everyone knows the work group that they're involved with as their primary work group. Think of it as a homeroom in a school. And each one of those teams is given components of larger projects, which the managerial structure then makes sure that communication is occurring between teams to actually get projects done. But their experts, their employees, are also encouraged to work with other teams to create temporary teams to come up with new goals and new innovative ways to function. Apple is another example of a renewal organization. They have broad goals to provide more choices and better products. Their results are innovative and a profitable company, and often considered one of the more innovative companies because the entire culture is set on how do we come up with new products, how do we adapt to what people want, and how do we actually predict what they want prior to that actually even being in the environment. And their success has been primarily attributed to this culture, defined by their co-founder, Steve Jobs, of the idea of constant innovation, constant renewal, always looking for a better way to do things, and always looking for a better product to create, in fact, to even create a need for the products in the consumers. Now, the managerial style, Jobs' approach did cause internal problems. His managerial style tended to throwing tantrums and humiliating employees that disagreed at the top level. And this is a good example of, again, even an organization that has this kind of organizational renewal mindset, we do have to monitor the entire process. And the top-down modeling, if you will, of behavior can also have a toxic effect in an organization. So though Jobs is often credited for creating a renewal organization, he himself, in a way, was part of one of the larger problems of the success of that organization internally in how it functioned.